Hey guys, in this episode, we're going to be talking about steady state versus interval training and which is best for hockey fitness and performance. A lot of the time, I see people asking me, what type of conditioning should I be doing? Or clients who come to work with me might have been trying certain things before, but it just hasn't really made an impact on their fitness, their conditioning, their ability to perform repeat sprint actions, and ultimately, it isn't impacting their performance on the pitch, which is what matters most fundamentally. So what we're going to do is just dive into three key areas here by principles that underpin which of these two is going to be best for us as hockey players and what we can do to improve our performance on the pitch most effectively. Now, field hockey is an intermittent team sport characterized by high intensity repeat sprint actions. Let's break that down. So it's intermittent, in other words, it's not long duration, steady state. It is short periods of work with short periods of recovery. It's high intensity. So in other words, we're working at high relative intensities compared to our maximums. This is usually quite polarized on the pitch. You're usually going to be doing a lot of kind of low intensity work, but then in short intermittent bursts of high intensity work repeatedly. And usually repeat sprint actions refers to something like six consecutive bouts of high intensity work on the pitch. So if we put that all together, hockey is a sport where you've got to be able to do high intensity work in short bursts with short recovery and do it again. That's really what hockey is all about. And there's a caveat to that, which I'll explain later on in terms of where the actual high intensity nature fits in as a percentage of the total work you're going to do on the pitch. But this gives you a bit of a clue as to where we might be going with this argument already. Now, when we look at some clips, and just to highlight, this is from Field Hockey Tube. So thank you for the great content there. Just wanted to make sure that was clear. It's not my content, but just wanted to give you a kind of snippet of some clips here which highlight what hockey looks like. So as you can see, defensive one-on-one, high intensity sprint, followed by change of direction, followed by high intensity action, which is a shot at speed on the angle. So that's a high intensity sprint, change of direction, and then a shot in short consecutive bursts. So that's being able to perform that high intensity work quickly, recover, quick, go again. Now on the pitch here again, this is GB. Similarly, that was an example of high intensity work down the pitch to create separation from the defender. Player gets the ball at the top of the D and then takes a shot from the top of the D in a short window. They've got to make sure to get that shot off quickly before the defender closes them down. So we're talking about really, really high intensity work being done here. Short bursts, high power, lots of short recovery periods in between that type of work. Pick another one. Got something like into the D here, and then again short, quick shot, got the shot away, and there's not a huge amount of recovery that's going to be allowed if you've got to do that again. Let's say there's a rebound, you've got to sprint and go again, take the second shot. So it's being able to perform these really, really high intensity actions with minimal recovery and then do it again and again and again. Now, over the course of a tournament, you're talking about, multiple high intensity actions that could be, on average, it's about one a minute that you happen to do. So if that's one every, one per 40 or 50 minutes that you're on the pitch for, it could be sort of, over the course of a week, you're talking about, 80, 100, 200 high intensity actions. So that's just to give you a little kind of highlight of, some different examples of high intensity actions here. And again, a lot of the examples you can see here is it's tightly congested, it's in the D. There's, short change of direction to create that separation, quick shot. There isn't kind of like a slow, steady state jog and a slow dribble round and then everything at the same intensity. It's bang, 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 quick, consecutive actions, short bursts, recover, get back to the start line, go again. Okay, so that really is some good examples here of what we're talking about. Okay, next up. It would seem on face value, therefore, that intervals would be better suited to hockey. But players around the world are using steady state runs like 5K to prepare themselves. And I hear this all the time. People wondering why they're not making a huge amount of progress when they're doing basically the same thing over and over again. So I'm going to try and dive into the principles behind why this would be, and why you'd expect to not get a huge amount of progress if you're just doing the same type of work over a long period of time. So why do people do 5Ks in the first place? One of the things I think is that it's easy to do. You just literally step out the door and go, and you can, as long as you're measuring it, you know how far it is. It's depending on how fast you're going to run it, 20 to 30 minutes approximately, and it's an easy one to measure. You know how far it is. It's a kind of yardstick, if you like, of your aerobic fitness. But the challenge I would give you to that is just think about how does it translate to performance? Yes, you might be improving your ability to perform aerobic work, but does it actually transfer to what you're being asked to do on the pitch? That's the most important thing here. So let's work out what's going to be better suited to you as a hockey player. So firstly, it's important to recognize the key training principles. We've got progressive overload, we've got individualization, and we've got specificity. These are three key training principles that never change, are always important, even if the methods that we pick can vary. There could be hundreds of methods you can pick from. The principles never change. We're always trying to progressively overload athletes. We're always trying to provide individualization to the athlete to make sure that it's relevant to them, and specificity to the nature of the sport's characteristics as well. Now, progressive overload means gradually increasing the demand placed on an athlete above their habitual level. Now that means the level that they're used to. So usually going from two sets to three sets from one week to the next would be an example of this. You would go from being comfortably capable of doing two sets of work across all the exercises, then going to bump that up to three. So we've increased the volume, and your body is then going to have to become accustomed to that new volume that it hasn't experienced before. On a conditioning side, if we were looking at doing steady state work, this could be doing half an hour of steady state and then moving it up to 40 minutes of steady state, or it could be doing three sets of intervals, bumping up to four sets of intervals, or it could be going from 105% of your mass score to 110% of your mass score week to week. Loads of examples here of how we can progressively overload someone, but the most important thing is that we are going above the habitual level, what the athlete is accustomed to completing. Now, to progress conditioning sessions, we can increase volume, intensity, density, or we can increase the rest or decrease, the rest periods, which really coincides with intensity if you think about it. So we can increase the volume, we could do more. We could increase the intensity, we can make it harder. We can increase the density, that means doing more work in a shorter period of time. That's not the same as volume because volume is independent of time, whereas density would be in a 20-minute block, we're going to do X amount, and then we're going to drop that to 15 minutes at the same volume, and so on. So that would increase the density of work being done. Or we can decrease the rest period. So we could be doing short, sharp work. You could be doing, say, 30 on, 30 off, and then we're going to drop that to 30 down to 15 seconds recovery between those reps in order to provide overload to the athlete. Now, steady state training needs to be long duration by design in order to achieve its aim, because typically we're looking at what's called central adaptation, things like increased cardiac output, capillarization, oxygen delivery. We need a lower intensity, higher volume approach to achieve those adaptations in the body. But this is tricky if your hockey volume is picking up too. So if, for example, you've got loads of hockey on, which a lot of hockey players do, you might be doing club, you might be doing regional stuff, you might be doing school stuff, depending on your age, university. If you've got loads of hockey on in the week, trying to add loads more volume, it doesn't make sense on two components. One, from a recovery standpoint, you're just giving your body too much, you're just doing loads of volume unnecessarily. And two, it isn't necessarily going to overload you because the hockey is going to give you a lot of this work anyway. If you're doing a high volume of hockey, guess what? You're doing a load of steady state work, because actually the majority of hockey, and we'll talk about the caveat to this in a second, is low intensity. Actually, probably 80% of the game is spent in lower activity or lower intensity activity. So if you're doing lots of hockey, you're getting loads of steady state work. So you have to give your body what the sport doesn't give you, and that's where intervals come in. But we can build out progressive training blocks that increase in demand much more easily with intervals. So as we said, if we wanted to try and increase the volume, the density, the intensity, or to reduce the rest periods, it's a lot easier to do this because you've got more variables to play with, and there are much easier ways of providing overload in a simple way. Whereas with steady state work, effectively, you can increase the speed at which you run, or you can run further. Whereas with intervals, we can change those blocks up in multiple ways, and we can overload those blocks in multiple ways. So we can play around with the sets and the reps, the intensity working at, the density of work, the rest periods in between. All of those things are loads of variables we can play around with there much more easily to make sure we're getting a really, really specific change and a really, really individualized approach to conditioning. So the winner in round one is interval training. Very simply, it's better suited to progressive overload because there are multiple ways in which we can play around with those variables to achieve the intended outcome that we want for the individual. Now, individualization, on the other hand, means matching a training program to the unique needs of the person, and that's based on their physical capability, injury history, and goals, amongst other factors. So, when we're talking about individualization, we mean trying to make it unique to that individual's needs, whereas specificity, as we'll talk about in a second, is about the sporting characteristics. So, physical capability, that comes down to assessment. If you don't know what your scores are on a math score, your 30-15 score, critical speed, things like that. If you don't know what those are, it's going to be very, very hard to make this unique to you because you don't know what your whether you're a speed profile, whether you're a hybrid profile, whether you're an endurance profile. All those factors that come into it really are going to determine what type of work you need to be doing. Injury history, again, if you have got a history of, and I have a client in this exact situation, in fact, who's got a history of chronic Achilles tendonitis, oftentimes that's load related, and a lot of the higher volume work kind of flares that up, whereas the shorter interval work means you can get a really good adaptation without the issue of trying to risk flaring up that tendon. So that's another way we can make it more individual. And then goals, amongst other factors. So, if we can relate this to performance, if your goal on the pitch is to improve your ability to perform those repeat sprint actions, and let's say you're a forward and you want to be able to create separation from a defender, so increase your acceleration, be able to recover from that high speed acceleration more quickly so that you can perform them more repeatedly to create more goal scoring opportunities. That's how we relate a physical adaptation to a performance goal. So that's how we can make it more unique to the needs of the individual. Now, when you don't use a baseline assessment, you don't get adequate individualization of running sessions. So in other words, if you don't have a baseline score of your math score, your 30-15, whatever test you're going to use here, you're not going to be able to individualize the training because you don't have a baseline to compare against. But the minute you do have that assessment and that baseline, you now have something to compare against and an ability to inform what those sessions now look like. So if it comes out that you're a hybrid profile, you know that you're going to be doing a combination of some shorter high intensity work plus a little bit of more endurance, longer interval work as well. If you're a speed profile, we know that you're going to have to be doing far more repeat sprint, high intensity work, short aerobic interval work, that type of thing. For an endurance profile, you can be doing perhaps some slightly longer interval work to match your physiological makeup as well. So we've got to make sure we're assessing to begin with. Now, without beginning with an objective measure, conditioning sessions can be too hard or too easy, and some players might be working relatively harder compared to their teammates too within a session. Let's say, for example, you've got 20 players in a team, you're doing a conditioning session together, you have done no assessment whatsoever, and you're getting everyone to run 15 on, 15 off. Some of those players will be working very, very hard because they won't have a baseline to compare against. Other players will be cruising and finding it very, very easy. So no one is really getting the adaptation they want. You're either overtraining or undertraining and not hitting that sweet spot. But if you know everyone's individual profile and you group them by those profiles and you give them specific sessions to do, so you've got your speed profiles, your hybrid profiles, your endurance profiles, doing different types of work, then they're going to be getting a far more specific adaptation. You then layer that on top with individual targets, so individual individual distances for those times. So if you're doing 15 seconds, you're going to give them an individual distance to aim for. Now what we've done is made everything very, very individualized, as opposed to this kind of broad brush, very kind of sloppy approach to conditioning where you're just doing the same for everyone. And very often steady state training is not based on assessment. Players just go for a 5K run or simply run for longer each week. That doesn't necessarily mean you're prescribing a session for yourself. You're not necessarily making that individualized yourself because you're just going out and doing a run. And there's some value in that at certain points of the season, which I'll talk about. But if you're not assessing, you're just guessing. So you've really got to understand, where are you at with your profile? What type of physiological makeup are you? Are you a speed profile? What's your mass score? What's your 30-15 score? What's your critical speed? And when you've got all that information, it makes it a whole load easier to be able to actually put this together. Now, you could use a baseline 5K for comparison. So that would be an example of an assessment. You could do a 5K run, time your best effort. You have now got an assessment and a baseline. But what are you actually trying to improve with that? Are you trying to improve your 5K time, or are you trying to improve your hockey performance? This now links back to this idea of specificity, whereby we're trying to target the training adaptations that relate to the characteristics of the sport. And hockey isn't a sport where we run 5K. Now, if you were a 5K runner, then yeah, sure, it's directly related to performance because that is the way in which your sport is measured. But hockey isn't measured by your ability to run 5K. It's measured by your ability to score goals, create separation, execute high intensity actions at speed, and do them again and again without fatigue. So that is the thing we're trying to improve, not running for 5K and improving your time in that. Now, as I say, there might be times in the season where that's beneficial because you might just be topping up a bit of volume you're now not getting from your hockey. So, for example, during the off-season period, it's a general training stimulus, just like doing bodybuilding style training. Again, it's very generic, but it can be a good option when you're now in the off-season because you're giving your body a general training stimulus when you've been doing a lot of specific hockey work. So that is the caveat to that argument. But got to think of that question. Are you trying to improve your 5K time or are you trying to improve your hockey performance? Now, intervals are much more likely to be based on assessments. This is a time trial, like if you did something like a 2,000 meter time trial, 16 pitch lengths, a 3-minute run, or a 30-15 intermittent fitness test. Those are usually the two best options for a hockey player to get a baseline of assessment because you can prescribe from it and you can actually understand your profile off the back of that as well. Now, what it means is that you can actually complete sessions like this. You could do things like 15 on, 15 off at 110% of your mass score, because once you know your mass score, you can do that. Or 30-15, so 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off at 105% of your mass score. Or 2 minutes on, a minute off at 90% of your mass score. Or if you used a 30-15 test, you could do something like 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off at 90% of your VIFT score, which is what comes from your 30-15. It's kind of like a hybrid score of maximum aerobic speed and anaerobic speed reserve. But that's a very different time. So long story short, if you've got the assessment, you can now prescribe from it and make it really, really individual. And these 3 sessions here are 3 different examples of 3 different types of sessions that are going to suit 3 different types of people. Now, not everyone is going to need to do 2 on, 1 off. Not everyone's going to need to do 15 on, 15 off. Depends on your assessments, depends what the scores tell you, and how that informs what the program design looks like for you individually. So the winner here in round 2, again, is interval training. It's a lot easier to individualize things when you've got assessments and you can play around with those variables a lot more easily. Lastly, then, specificity means training should be relevant to the physical demands of the sport, not generic training. Okay, it has to be relevant to the physical demands of the sport. Now, the first step is to understand those physical demands, because if they're not known, then how could we ever ensure that they're actually driving adaptation and making you a better player? So you've got to understand that first of all. What are the physical demands of the sport? This means your conditioning session should be reflective of the underlying characteristics of hockey. As we've said already, it's a repeat sprintability sport. That is the defining characteristic of the sport from a physical standpoint. So we've got to make sure that our training sessions and everything we're doing is reflective of that. As we've already seen, hockey is a repeat sprintability sport, so that's what we're preparing for. We're not preparing for continuous steady state running. But this is the caveat. The vast majority of hockey is actually spent in low intensity walking or running. So I've completely contradicted myself here because actually it's, the specific percentages vary by the playing level and that type of thing. But as a broad brush approach, 70 to 80% of the game is actually spent in relatively low intensity walking and running. And what that means is that actually the majority of the game isn't repeat sprintability sport. So that although the sport is a repeat sprintability sport by design, most of the time in the game actually isn't spent performing repeat sprintability actions, largely because you just couldn't do it. You couldn't sustain repeat sprintability work for the entirety of the game because it would be completely exhausting. And obviously the nature of the game is that only a small number of players are actually involved in the direct action at any one particular point, which is why everyone else is moving into position at a low intensity. But that's not what causes the team to win. It's not the low intensity work that wins games. It's the teams that can perform max intensity work, recover quickly, and perform them again. That is the kind of critical point here. Although the game is the majority at low intensity, that's not where the game is won. As we saw in those clips, the game is won in high intensity moments where you're going to get quick bursts of speed, change direction, hit a shot from the top of the D, bang a goal in, change direction again, for the deflection. Those are the defining moments of the game. It's not when you're moving at slow speed into position on the pitch, waiting to receive the ball. So that's the kind of contrast. There's lots of low intensity work, yes, But the defining moments and actually what wins the game is high intensity repeat sprint ability work. So hockey's won in the 20% of the game where high intensity actions are executed, not the 80% of lower intensity work. And ultimately, players need to be able to perform at high intensity, not low intensity. So there's only one winner again. As you can see, interval training wins this one 3-0, coming out as the clear favourite for hockey players. But just a caveat, as I've said already, there are times when doing steady state work is absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with it inherently. It's just making sure that what you're doing is relevant to you, it's based on assessment, it's relevant to the demands of the game, and you can progressively overload it in a clear way. And if you can't do those three things, it's going to be very, very hard to target and really, really make a difference on the pitch. This is why with my clients, everything is assessed, everything's individualized, everything is impact on the pitch. And they notice that change because you know what the numbers are, you know what type of conditioning you should be doing. The sessions you're doing are very relevant to what it is you're trying to change. And then that is when you see the impact on your performance and you become a better player for it. So please make sure you are assessing, you are making things individual for yourself, you are making it specific to the game, and you are overloading your training in a way that makes logical sense to you. Hope that's been useful. I'll put some links down below for some free resources. Download them, check them out. I've got a free conditioning ebook, and hopefully that adds even more value for you as well.